morning and welcome to Rising. Thanks for tuning in. A lot more to get to today, more updates on the situation in Israel. Go ahead, Briahna.
Well, Robby, President Biden spoke to Americans directly from the White House yesterday, where he condemned Hamas's attack on Israel in the strongest possible terms.
Bloodthirstiness brings to mind the worst rampages of ISIS. This is terrorism. But sadly, for the Jewish people, it's not new. This attack has brought to the surface painful memories and the scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and genocide of the Jewish people. So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel. And we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack. There's no justification for terrorism. There's no excuse. Hamas does not stand for the Palestinian people's right to dignity and self-determination. Its stated purpose is the annihilation of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed with no regard to who pays the price.
Now, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was pressed on reporting that the Biden administration may be seeking to tie weapons and aid to Ukraine to military assistance to Israel.
So I'm not going to get ahead of the president's request and not going to take the place of the OMB director who will present the request that we send up. But the president was very clear today that we will be making a request to the Congress. And it will include a request for funding for support to Israel. And he has also been equally clear that we are going to renew our request to the Congress for aid to Ukraine. What exact form that all takes, that will be worked out and presented by others, not by me. But the notion that we're going to go up and ask for Israel aid and ask for Ukraine aid, that's unequivocal.
House Republican and Speaker candidate Jim Jordan was pressed on the potential deal as well.
Mr. Jordan, Israel aid would obviously be a big part of your speakership. Would you be open to tying that to Ukraine aid?
We got to help Israel, that's for sure.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to travel to Israel to shore up U.S. support for their retaliation very soon. So we're seeing these two things, the framing that the media wants, as that was CNN pressing Jim Jordan, pressuring Republican leadership or presumptive leadership, obviously we don't actually know who's going to be the Speaker of the House yet, to link these things together. It seems pretty clear that that is also what Biden wants to do. Going to be interesting to see how that plays out, given that Republicans are extremely hostile to additional funding for Ukraine. And in fact, the whole Speaker implosion was substantially about that. Now, many Republicans have also signaled that they think it is very important to give even more military aid to Israel. Of course, we already give military aid to Israel to send warships and everything else. I think these two ideas are a little bit in tension, and I'm not sure the base actually thinks that giving more aid to either country ultimately is the obligation of U.S. taxpayers and enhances U.S. security. So I think it's going to be interesting to see this double standard play out and see if Biden gets his way on both fronts.
Yeah, well, I think it's worth noting that it's not that a lot of Republicans object to funding Ukraine more. A lot more Republicans than Democrats do. But again, we had the speakership crisis over a very small minority of Republicans, and they only were able to do this because the margins in the House were only +4. So I do wonder whether, given the relatively small size of the cohort that was willing to oust McCarthy largely over the Ukraine funding, with the additional pressure of funding Israel, which there's much more consensus on, as you heard Jim Jordan say as he was pressed, well, we gotta fund Israel for sure. Whether or not that's going to pressure that already small group of holdouts into finally capitulating over Israel aid. And I do think that that's the clear hope as people rhetorically tie these two bundles of aid together. I want to go back to the president's remarks. It is unsurprising. It's in line with what he and every other president has said before when these kinds of things happen, that America stands unequivocally with Israel. The Empire State Building was lit up in blue and white. The White House was lit up in blue and white. But I do wonder if, given the increasing pressure, I think, from the public, as they're increasingly aware of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, whether or not statements made in support of Israel and statements condemning the terrorist attacks and the killing of civilians will increasingly be coupled with any kind of acknowledgement that there needs to be some peace that is based on resolving the fundamental issue in Gaza. You did hear him say, Palestinians have a right to self-determination, but that's a really interesting thing to say when America is one of the minority countries in the world that doesn't recognize Palestine as a state, and when there's so little lip service given, so little said about the leveling of Gaza that is going on right now. As we've discussed, it's a population that's one of the most densely packed populations in the world, with 2 million people in what's been described as an open-air prison. And currently, as a result of the retaliatory strikes, 10% of the population of Gaza is internally displaced. And because it is a walled open-air prison, there's nowhere for those people to go. And as we discussed, it's a population with 50% children. So it is interesting to continue to hear the president and people in his administration largely ignore or not say anything about the war crimes that have come in the other way now after the obvious war crime of killing civilians that Hamas has committed, the violation of international law that is bombing these civilian populations, and having the strategy of cutting off water and food and electricity to an entire population that, of course, is not Hamas and was not at fault for the slaughter of all of those Israeli civilians. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any mounting pressure on Biden to change his rhetoric in any way on that. Sure.
I mean, I didn't find the statement objectionable. I would bet that most people, both Democrats and Republicans, found the statement fine, doing, as you said, acknowledging that Palestinians do have a right to self-determination, and then pointing out, obviously, that terrorist attacks on random civilians is not a good way to accomplish that goal. But I agree with you on the underlying the funding issue. We're going to end up supporting. We are in support. We give money to. We contribute. The American taxpayer contributes to retaliatory actions by the state of Israel that will result in further horrific loss of life. And this is a really, again, this is something we're on the hook for. That, again, how does this contribute to American national security? This is going to terrorist groups like Hamas use this kind of thing as recruitment, as reason for Muslim extremists throughout the Middle East to speak out against America because of our role in funding what you rightly describe as military actions that violate international norms. So I don't want to be on the hook for that, and I think a lot of Republican primary voters actually don't either, which is why leadership is so out of step with what people want on so many issues, but including this. And they should take Ukraine as a lesson that the neoconservative project of funding wars, even if you think they're justified, even if you think Israel should respond in some way and is completely justified to attack and dismantle and destroy Hamas. Why is America responsible for contributing, for donating to this effort even more than we already have? Because there are conflicts all over the globe, and Republican voters spoke, vis-a-vis Donald Trump, who was all about America, who, at least in his rhetoric, was about America first and was about concentrating on solving our issues here in the country. And he articulated that clear break from the consensus and won the nomination because of it. So I wish more leaders in the Republican Party would listen to, would take that as an example on both the Ukraine issue, which they learned a little bit, but as you note, it's still a minority position. It's a super minority position on the Democratic side. It's the entire Democratic Party's personality is the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And then honestly on this, except with a couple of your squad member people, the Democratic Party is all for funding Israel additionally, honestly, military aid, whatever they want.
You say except for the squad
and
members,
I'm not even sure that's an exception.
AOC, one of the early disappointing moments for the left was her choice to capitulate after an argument, some kind of back and forth with Nancy Pelosi on the House floor about Iron Dome funding. And that was one of the big moments on the left where it was a wake-up call as to how dominated, controlled, coerced, whatever the squad members were by former House leadership. So we'll be talking a little bit more about the various responses the left have had to this conflict and the pushback they've been having with their base.
And we're going to get into more details of what we've learned on the ground in the last 24 hours. But I think we've got a little bit more. Yeah,
well, the New York Times' Tom Friedman appeared on CNBC this morning where he had this message for opponents to aid in Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin is licking his chops and saying, if the flow of Western weapons to Ukraine is cut off for a week, they're finished. He's just gonna have free reign of the skies. And so, can I just say to every one of the Republican lawmakers talking about just cutting off military aid to Ukraine, that is one of the most shameful, embarrassing, disgusting things I can imagine an American government doing in the history of our country. What the hell is wrong with you people?
I mean, I do think that Republicans need to, and I was thinking about this after looking at the remarks at a Code Pink event, a left anti-war group that was founded after the 9/11 attacks that met in D.C. last week. They were very clear to couple their argument about not funding Ukraine with an argument pushing peace negotiations and really framing it as a desire to save Ukrainian lives and Russian lives alike. A lot of soldiers who are forced through conscription to fight, et cetera, to end the fighting. So much of it, I think, it's characterized as you just want to abandon Ukrainians, you want the worst for Ukrainians, you don't care what happens to them, you want to abandon them in the middle of struggle. But if you're facing a funding crisis like this because of what's going on in the House, this exposes the vulnerability of your situation and how coupled your fate is to the political whims of a country halfway across the world. And this is exactly why, from the beginning, the emphasis for anybody who wanted peace and wanted to save the lives of those people should have been focused on resolution as opposed to continuing the fighting to weaken Russia, as was the stated objective of our military. So I don't know. I do think that Republicans who are heading this message should be refocused on peace, and they should be talking and resurfacing all of those various moments that we now are aware of as early as 1 month after the conflict emerged, where there were real peace negotiations on the table that were affirmatively thwarted by our government and the British government.
And look, we've done our part. We've given Ukraine a lot of aid. Tom Friedman there is saying, I think he's trying to encourage people to, keep up the fight, to continue wanting to give aid because of how dire the situation is. But if it's true that they're going to lose immediately the second funds are withdrawn, this reminds me of what neoconservative hawks said about the Middle East, about withdrawing from Iraq or Afghanistan. That it'll collapse immediately. We'll lose immediately. Then what have we done? If what we've contributed to is so fragile that it takes our super involvement at all times, or it will immediately collapse, doesn't that make the entire project seem a little worthless? Yeah. Seem like not a realistic use of our resources? We need to be clear-headed. We need to be rational, and contrary to what he says there, it's the elites and the interventionists who are not at all realistic about the limits of American power and dollars and money and what this means for our own security and what the American people actually want. They're living in a fantasy land, not us.
I think I saw this in an early John Mearsheimer, I think he's at the University of Chicago, and he's an expert on the region. And many people looked to him as the crisis emerged because he had spoken really compellingly about it beforehand. But one of the points that was made was Russia's there. Russia has a different kind of interest in the region because it is in the region. It's talking about its own borders. So U.S., as we can see through the division about the subject in Congress and the American public being divided basically 50-50 on this, more against additional funding than for additional funding, that our investment just isn't ever going to be what Russia's investment is. Mm-hmm. So if Ukrainians' fate is so contingent on us, and America's investment is so fragile, then from a negotiating perspective, the idea that we are going to just wait it out No, Russia is going to be able to wait
with
it
our
out.
European partners contributing nothing compared to what we're contributing. Maybe if this is such an important goal to make sure that the entire borders of Ukraine remain exactly as they were without any territorial concession to Russia. Again, I'm not sure this is a very important U.S. national security goal, but if this is so important to France and Germany and England and the rest of them, then they can help pay for it. They should take up the responsibility of paying for the bulk of it, which they haven't done, because here's America to save the day. That's not something that the American people are satisfied with, nor should they be.
Yeah, a good point. All right, stick around. We'll have more Rising for you after this.